Well, let me welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Just delighted to see that a number of hardy souls braved the elements. And I do want to assure both our audience and our panelists that although not all of Washington is watching, we are webcasting today's conference. So much of the world is watching, and we are also going to post that webcast on our website, so people who weren't able to watch it today will be able to see it in the future. One other business keeping step I would like, if everyone could actually turn off their PDA or their cell phone, that apparently even if it's on quiet, it can disturb the webcasting. Please don't ask me for an explanation of why that's the case. Although we talk technology here, I'm one of those people who is electronically challenged. So our tech people ask us to ask you to do that. Well, let me just say a word or two about the Woodrow Wilson Center for those of you who are new here. I'm Kent Hughes. I run a program here on science, technology, America, and the global economy, which necessarily has a heavy focus on Doha, on trade, and international finance. The Woodrow Wilson Center itself was established in 1968 by the Congress as a living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. They decided against another marble statue or a monument and instead wanted to capture both sides of Wilson's life. Wilson, as you may know, was the only president to have had a PhD. And in his era, he was quite a prominent political scientist. Went on then to be president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and president. He often commented that because of his background in political science, he thought he became more effective as a policy maker when he was in the political arena, and often reflected on the thought that had he had more of this real-world experience, it would have enriched and helped direct his research. So Congress charged us with the responsibility of taking both sides, if you will, of Wilson's life and focusing on bringing together the people who are the thinkers and the doers, the people that are reflecting on policy and the people who are on the front lines of actually making policy. Part of what we've been doing at the Wilson Center, and in some cases in partnership with others, is to focus not only on the Doha round in general, but what does it suggest with regard to growth and development and poverty alleviation in many of the countries that are still relatively new to the global economy. We are delighted today to be co-sponsoring the event with the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council. And this is not our first joint venture. Out on the table you will find some publications, one of which focuses on a recent conference focused on African cotton and the potential that the Doha round holds for African cotton growers. We worked with the IPC, and then we also worked with the Ideas Group in Geneva. And there are a number of other items, some from IPC and another report on a conference at the Wilson Center, that I think you'll all find useful in terms of reflecting on where we might go with regard to trade, agriculture, Doha, and development in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. Well, it is my added pleasure to introduce the co-chair of today's session, Charlotte Heberbrand, who is and has been for a year the president of the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council. I'm working on her to shorten that name so that I can get it out a little more quickly. As I mentioned, we collaborated on the Cotton Conference together. Charlotte brings an enormous background to this question of agriculture trade. She worked with the European Commission on trade, development, and agriculture for 12 years. She has a distinguished, really international background. She's originally from Germany and studied here, however, in the United States, both at Georgetown and then a master's degree at the School for Advanced International Studies. Charlotte, let me turn it over to you to introduce today's speakers. And I want to apologize that our two U.S. speakers have been unavoidably detained, that ice can deter even the most determined negotiator, it turns out. But both Charlotte and I are guilty of having misspent much of our youth looking at trade and that sort of thing. So we will attempt to fill in when it gets to the question period, if that's appropriate. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kent, and I want to thank you and your staff for co-hosting this event with us. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to all of you for braving the elements. I can only imagine how our African visitors feel. We think it's bad enough, but for them this must be quite an experience to wake up in an icy Washington. So a very special welcome to all of you, especially to our African visitors who've come from so far away. Let me just say a couple of words about the IPC. I'll just use that because I agree it's a long name, Kent. I like to think of us as an advocacy-based think tank. We have a group of very distinguished members from around the world. One of our members, in fact, is sitting up here, AJ Vashi, who will speak to us later. Our members really span the globe. We have some former ministers of agriculture, trade, development. We have former negotiators from the Uruguay round. We have a number of private sector representatives, and I'd like to point out Jim Starkey here in the audience from Universal. Also, Ann Tutwiler is now one of our members. She's my predecessor at the IPC. We have farm leaders such as AJ, we have academics. It's really a broad group of people. And we try to examine agricultural trade policy with a focus on working towards a fair and open trading system, in particular so that developing countries can take advantage of their competitive advantage in exporting food and agricultural products. Why are we hosting this event? When we learned that the Secretary General of COMESA was coming to Washington for TIFA talks, we thought this would be a great opportunity for folks who follow the trade and ag issues in Washington to hear from him and to remind us a little bit about the development focus in the Doha Development Agenda, because I think perhaps all too often in this town people get overly focused about which commodity groups are going to get which level of support. So let's take a step back and look at this from a more global perspective. We have asked the Secretary General to discuss what Doha means for Africa, but also to explain a little bit more the other trade priorities that are before Africa right now. Regional trade obviously is a big undertaking in Africa. There are negotiations going on with the EU. There is increased investment and trade with countries such as India and China. The focus on agriculture clearly is not only because agriculture has proven to be the most difficult part of the Doha negotiations, but also because it is such a crucial sector in Africa. It accounts for 1/3 of African GDP. And in some countries, it can employ up to 60 to 90% of the workforce. It's a key economic sector, especially for Africa's poor. More focus has been given to agriculture in Africa in recent years, and in fact, there has been more growth in the sector, but a lot more remains to be done. So we'd like to have this discussion on trade and agriculture in COMESA this morning. So it's my big pleasure to introduce Erastus Mwencha, who's the Secretary General of COMESA. He is serving as Secretary General for the second term, but he has really been with COMESA before it was COMESA. He joined the preferential trade area back in 1983 and has had many positions within the organization. So I think he really can give us an excellent overview of the history of COMESA, having been there really from the very beginning. Mr. Mwencha studied economics at the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and then he did postgraduate studies at York University in Toronto. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Let's speak them.
Do you want to go up there? Or?
Do you want me to come, or you stay there?
This is the PowerPoint, and the thing is here. Oh, I can run it.
I can click it.
Yeah.
Do you prefer to stand or?
Okay.
Maybe sit.
You stand. You do it.
I'll run it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Charlotte. When we arrived here 2 days ago, we learned that there was going to be a storm. And everywhere we went, and especially in my previous visits here, people were saying, you brought with you a good weather, because I've always been coming in summer. Now, it looks like this time we brought you a storm. And I'm not surprised, because in our delegation we had farmers, and Charlotte I said agriculture has been the most difficult in the WTO, and that's what we discussed this morning. So I'm ready to pass on the storm to come to you. I'll just give you an overview before we go into the actual nitty-gritty. The presentation this morning will focus on, of course, I'll speak out of this outline briefly, but the outline is just to give the general positions on the Doha development agenda, but also look at what Charlotte has just mentioned, the elements of, development, the development aspect within the Doha development agenda, and what modalities we see should be in place as part of the package of the Doha, and of course specifically look at this sector of agriculture. I'm also happy to learn that your partners in some way are also our partners, like IFPRI. We've just signed a memorandum of understanding with IFPRI to be partners in implementing the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. And also I see in the Middle East some of our partners like WWFP, worldwide program, and so that partnership, including yourself, is growing, and that is exactly what we see coming out of this agenda. Now, talking about the WTO, for us in Africa, right from the beginning, we have always supported the multilateral because we believe as a rule-based and as a tool that can help the vulnerable, it has value because many of us cannot be able to do that which WTO is best suited to do at bilateral discussions. In fact, we always say that Africa needs more WTO more than the rest of the world, and that's an element that continues to worry us, especially in the recent negotiations. Yesterday, we had an opportunity to meet with Ambassador Susan Swap, and one of our messages to her was that as you talk among the big players, the European Union, the US, the G20, and all those, please don't forget us, because we tend to be grass as the elephants are fighting. And we keep on reminding that really the Doha development agenda, the aspect of development was partly to put Africa in focus. And so that should not be left, especially when we focus on the issues that stand as sticky issues. And as Charlotte has rightly mentioned, agriculture is one area that we feel could bring a lot of benefit to WTO, particularly as the statistics she has just read indicate. But her statistics are even more grimmer than what she gave the bright side, because she said it contributes about 30%, employs about 60%. But when you look at the facts on the ground, farmers in Africa are perhaps the worst hit in all aspects. They are the poorest of the poor, and that is where the challenge is. And the question is, where do we find solutions that can address this big segment of the population? We believe the answers are global, the answers are regional, the answers are at the national level, the answers are at the farm level. Now, this is what we are trying to do, but we believe that without all the players, also things coming together, there is a clear indication at the WTO that, yes, we are going to solve these obstacles. We can build capacity for these farmers to be able to access their local market, the national market, the international market. Then we are stuck. That's why it's so crucial to us. But there are also other issues that we see beyond the farming community. And that is the elements in the WTO that concern quota-free, duty-free. We know that in Hong Kong there was the agreement, the move to give the 98%, 97%. Now, one of the things we were discussing with USTR yesterday is, what is this 3%? Because given the magnitude of what the 3% can be, you can also exclude all the elements that are of interest to us. And so we are asking, will there be transparency? Can we see how this will be arrived at? And of course, there are also concerns that have been brought to us, particularly by the US, that are said, maybe some of the 3% would take care of your needs, because as we know what is happening, especially under NAMA, the preferences are being phased out, more or less they're being wiped out. Maybe the 3% is where we could take care of your interest by safeguarding certain products. And it's true, and that is where it poses a dilemma, because I know, for instance, if you look at the AGOA provisions, in the last many years, we in Africa always said we were not able to access the US market because of competitiveness. We were able to access the US market more on a quota basis than on competitiveness. But those are elements that we would like to be able to discuss in detail. Now, let's go back then to the Doha, the elements we said. What is the importance of the development? It looks to us that there is more or less agreement that under the WTO, the least developed countries whose majority live in Africa may not necessarily be undertaking obligations. But bear in mind that there will be obligations that will arise from some agreements, and those agreements will also carry with them a special and differential treatment. Now, those are what we see as development tools. But one important tool for us is improved, before I come to that, is the supply side. How we can be able to solve the many problems that face the supply side. Because we are saying improved market access is not enough. In fact, if you look at Africa's trade, for example, with Europe, who are our neighbors and with whom we have been trading for a long time, 25, 30 years ago, our trade with Europe was importing almost 7% of requirements from Africa. That is now down to about 3%. If you look at global trade, Africa's participation in global trade was about 6%. It's now down to about 2%. So, and what has gone wrong? Again, the recent studies have shown that Africa can be competitive at a farm level. The problem is getting out of the farm and being able to deal with environmental issues that have also got the supply chain issues, moving the goods from the farm to the consumer. You face lots of obstacles, challenges, particularly the infrastructure. That's why we want to focus more on the development, the supply side aspect. Now, the key aspect of the supply aspect is infrastructure. Infrastructure that has got to do with roads, infrastructure for farmers especially, to be able to have SPS capacity, testing, accreditation, and transportation that can be able, cooling facilities that can reach the farmer and the consumer, but also infrastructure at the level of even financial infrastructure. And some of the basics, communication, because some of the farmers where we have seen, for instance, now cellular phone is reaching farmers in the rural areas. And the farmers need to know, to understand the pricing structure, the market requirements. And so these are some of the aspects we can start to say, how can we tailor them so that we are able to address and communicate with the farmer, and also those that come along to work with the farmer before the product reaches the table or consumer end. Now, one of the points that is still not clear even under the WTO is how best to implement aid for trade. We see an element, and this is one aspect we have even also raised with the MCC, too much focus on country. And yet we see Africa, particularly Africa, being small nation states, many of them landlocked, and with some peculiar elements we cannot simply focus on a country, because one year you have a good agricultural produce, the farmers need to dispose of that surplus. The following year there is a shortage, you need the country to import. And so if you focus so much of a country, it will affect, it will not have much impact. So we need to look into it to put in a regional perspective. And that's one aspect we've been bringing on the table. In fact, even on Millennium Challenge account, saying we need to re-examine it and see how best it can be able to work, because a landlocked country can only go so far in improving its competitiveness. Because when we talk of infrastructure, we are essentially talking about infrastructure. And we have said the competitiveness is not so much at the farm level. It is that which happens outside the farm, and that which also would happen outside the country if a country is landlocked. Now, the other aspect, of course, for aid for trade, we are worried is whether there is really additional resources as such. In fact, yesterday we were asking Susan, is it old wine that is being put in new bottles and being repackaged and all that? That is a matter that remains to be seen. I know that the Aid for Trade group in Geneva is also looking at the aspect of having a monitoring mechanism. But that monitoring should also go down the road to see that we can identify the target. Let's not just simply focus on the source of funding, but also look at the end use, so that we bring round the table clarity, accountability, and also partnership. And that's one of the things that we are doing. Needs to be targeted at improving the competitiveness. If we are going to be able to be targeting, there is also a very important element that we should form a partnership, so that it's clear who's doing what and who's performing, who's got what responsibility. At the moment, if you go, say, to the sectors like agriculture, and this applies to other sectors, there is no coordination mechanism. And that's one aspect that we bring to the table together with our partners, particularly in implementing CARDIP. And so, what should we be talking about now in CARDIP here? CARDIP itself, as we have indicated, is African-led priorities that have been identified, but as also partnership. And we're happy, particularly, the support and the expression of intentions that CARDIP has received from many of our development partners. If you look at the way CARDIP is structured, we have 4 pillars under CARDIP. If I could skip just to show how CARDIP is structured. Do you have that? Yeah, it's the next one. The way CARDIP is structured, we have 4 pillars that CARDIP is going to focus on. Pillar number 1 is land and water management, and one can say a lot. I want to leave some time for us to be able to discuss, so maybe I can leave for clarification rather than spend so much time on that. Number 2 is trade and market infrastructure. This is where the regional perspective comes in. From a commercial perspective, we have realized that we can develop regional markets. There can be a strong incentive, first of all, to enhance competitiveness, but also even as an end in itself, because you are looking at 400 million people. If you look at imports, what Africa is importing annually, there is a huge market out there that can be met. But it's so difficult for trade to take place in Africa because of many problems. They range from SPS to difficulties of movement to removing barriers, particularly administrative blocks for goods moving across borders. The third pillar, of course, is to ensure food and nutrition security, and particularly for vulnerable groups. This is an area, again, we had an opportunity 2 days ago to meet with the new World Food Program Director General Designate, Ambassador China. And one of the elements we are discussing is how can we structure food aid in Africa? Because we are going to continue to need food aid. There's no question about it. But how can we manage food aid in such a way that it doesn't cause dependence? It doesn't affect long-term sustainability of agriculture. And I'm sure Ache will talk more on that. The fourth pillar is technology. And this is where Africa is also losing out, particularly coming late on some of the areas that technology could contribute a lot. Up to now, we are still debating what should we do with GM. Should Africa maybe continue to focus on organic? What is the best alternative? But those are essential debates. But there is even a fundamental element of debate that we should be looking at. When you go to a farmer and he's just using a hoe and is going to carry the tea or whatever on their head to the factory, there is so much that can be done. That there is very many constraints that a farmer would face in such a situation. Adoption of technology, but at what cost is this technology going to come? How are we going to reach this farm? How are we going to get them to access credit? These are things that we should go to the ground and look at a farmer and also try to meet their needs. The other element of aid for trade, as part of the package of, say, CADIP, we see is supporting countries to cope with the liberalization that comes along with obligations that we take, and particularly at the regional level. Because if countries are reluctant to open up their markets because maybe there is revenue implications, we are not able to support certain vulnerable groups that will be affected through competition, then we see these walls continue to be erected with strong lobby groups. You know how strong lobby groups can be. I mean, why is agriculture facing problems is mainly because of lobbying. And we have them also, lobbyists all over the place. So this is one area we need to think of. How can we mitigate against, unfavorable situations? But at the same time, we know that liberalization also brings with it erosion of preferences. And that takes us to another area of concern. How do we then schemes like AGOA, what will schemes like economic partnership agreement bring to the table if we are going, NAMA is under the WTO discipline. If you look at the tariff structure now, the US, you are literally talking of 2-3% on industrial products. So there is no preference. So what we need to focus is to improve our competitiveness, to improve our capacity so that we can produce as any in the world. Otherwise, schemes like AGOA and economic partnership will not bring a lot of benefit to the table. And so Africa has also to prepare to understand that we have to play a league at a super level, but yet we haven't even learned to play the game at provincial level. These are real challenges. For us, as COMESA, we have established mechanisms like a fund that is intended to look at mitigation issues, a fund that is supposed to provide incentives as we move to more competitive environment, but also to coordinate the development of infrastructure. And this is where we invite our partners to come and partner with us so that we can address the development issues. So what are the key messages that we are talking about? We are supportive of the fact that let's remove distortions, domestic support and export subsidies. We are, we are on board as far as the WTO being a rule-based institution where we should be able to support the multilateral framework. But we are saying, let's not forget the elements that constitute the Doha development agenda, the development aspect. We know that NAMA will come with some cost because we will face erosion of preferences, but this then should be addressed within the framework of the development aspect. Another important aspect I should have mentioned as I was making the presentation is that trade in services is significant. In fact, if you look at many of our African economies, they are becoming very strong in this area. But we lack capacity. Again, we go back to development so that, in fact, under the WTO, for instance, in COMESA, only 3 countries are at the table as being in the offensive side, Kenya, Egypt, and Mauritius. The rest are not even talking about it because there is no capacity. This is another area that we should continue to support. And finally, of course, for us to focus on the development, we have put our own resources on the table. Even the COMESA Fund is our own mechanism. We're trying to mop whatever resources is within the continent to do this, and we are inviting our partners to come with us so that we can address these issues. It's not that we are just stretching a hand out to say aid as such, but we are also coming to the table to say this is what we are doing for ourselves, and we would like to partner with you. And this is why there is the CADIB. The agenda is owned by us, and so is the vision, and so is the tools that we want to implement. I thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I think it's an excellent reminder that market access alone is not sufficient, and that we really do need to pay attention to the supply side constraints and focus on how best to implement the Aid for Trade initiative. Chris, I forgot to introduce you. Why don't you join us up here? Chris Muyunda is the agricultural expert at COMESA, so perhaps he would also like to jump in. I'm now going to turn to AJ. It's a great pleasure to have a real farmer at the table. AJ Vashi is the president of both the Zambian National Farmers Union as well as of the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions, which is a federation of ag associations in Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Namibia. He worked as a member of Zambia's delegation to the WTO ministerial meetings, both in Seattle and Cancun. And he really follows very closely all of the different trade negotiations that COMESA is involved with. So we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, and good morning. And I assure you I had nothing to do with the weather. Just a brief of how I'm going to proceed with my presentation today, a little bit about my organization. It's developed a little bit more. The DDA, what are the expected outcomes the farmers of Southern Africa are looking at, a little bit more elaboration on the EPAs, and just a brief comment on the developments in the United States and how we believe this will impact on us in Southern Africa. SACAO is basically a confederation of national farmers organization, and we've now grown through to 13 national farmers organizations in Southern Africa. Our vision is a vibrant, prosperous, and sustainable farming sector that ensures food security and contributes to economic growth. Our mission is to promote the development of strong farmers' representation in the region, to support farmers' organization capacities, and most importantly, to advance and protect the common interests of national farmers' organization and regional commodity producers, which gives us quite a big mandate. Some of our strategic goals to develop the capacity of SACAO and its members, to improve market access and promote trade opportunities, to participate in the development of regional agriculture policies and programs, and to promote sustainable agriculture. So trade is a very important component. Comment on the Doha Development Agenda. Like it's been said, the farming sector and the private sector and the farmers, including the small-scale farmers, believe and support the multilateral trading system. And there's a myth that a lot of farmers in Africa don't support the WTO. I think there's a growing awareness and realization that collectively in a forum like the WTO, our leverage and our ability to move our issues is a lot stronger. We're in a lot of a stronger position than on a one-to-one or a bilateral. So the myth that we don't support the WTO is totally incorrect. Perhaps it's the way it's been negotiated and the outcomes may not be acceptable, but certainly the multilateral trading system is well supported. We believe that the whole round has lost sight of the development agenda. It's become more of a market access and goods and services and other issues. The development aspect has totally been overlooked. It's more like it's been given at the benevolence of the developed countries and, okay, we'll try and see if we can do this when they get reminded, which was initially not the understanding. And that creates a bit of frustration when we are negotiating, when we are talking, because the understanding of, again, what is development, and in our context is a bit different from perhaps what the developed countries believe. Market access, domestic support, and export subsidies, we believe the development aspect is a cross-cutting issue across all three pillars and should be not lost sight of. It's across all three pillars that we are looking at the developmental aspect of Doha. What are our expected outcomes? Obviously, this is a wish list, but reduction, total elimination of tariffs, reduction, elimination of export subsidies, a newer addition which was brought in from Hong Kong, where we were, was the duty-free, quota-free for LDC countries. Again, this came about because we believed in the original text, it just said that LDC countries may benefit from preferential access, and when this, if you marry this with the EPA negotiations that were going on, we were worried about preferences, and we said this had to be brought in place. Obviously, we haven't got a good deal. We've got 97%. The Secretary General said that there's still an element of 3%. But nonetheless, this is a newer addition that came in from our side, basically to address concerns of LDC countries, so that there could be some sort of synergy with the EPA negotiations. Cotton, I know I was told it's a bad word to say this in America when you talk about cotton subsidies and farmers, but this is an issue which is at the heart of the African negotiation as well. It's not going to be something that's going to be glossed over. It's going to remain on the agenda. We'll still be looking for a more ambitious treatment. I know there's been some dates that have been put through as to when cotton subsidies will be eliminated and there'll be special treatment for cotton. But nonetheless, we are still looking for more ambition on cotton. Special products, again, it came about because of this development aspect. If the developed countries have sensitive products, then we should have the ability to have them. Special products, obviously, we're going to look at those for more especially for food security. And again, what needs to be seen is how we apply all these rules as they're being negotiated, because there's a real danger that in the end you won't really have advanced or perhaps gone backwards with some of the provisions that have been put forward. Newer rules, I don't think new, but perhaps more streamlined rules on the application of anti-dumping procedures reform. We are requiring more transparency, more predictability, and less discrepancy, because these are some of the rules which we have never been able to invoke effectively and to our satisfaction. Special rules for developing countries on dispute settlement. If you see how many actionable notifications have been received by the WTO, you'll find that very few have come from developing countries apart from Brazil and maybe India. Most of the African countries have not been able to use this mechanism. So we're looking at special rules for developing countries that will allow us to use this dispute settlements and other provisions between the WTO. SDT treatment, again, under the round, everybody thinks development means SDT, not necessarily. SDT is a component. Even from the original rounds, SDD was something that was going to be put in place to allow us to catch up It was never something like a development instrument. It has just been brought forward, and all we're saying is to refine SDT to be more precise, effective, and operational. But it should not be misconstrued to mean that is the development part of the Doha negotiation. Regional trade agreements, here again, we are finding that as we evolve our economies with COMESA, SADC, and others in Southern Africa, the compatibility of anti-dumping, countervailing rules, and all that, there needs to be more clarity of compatibility with WTO, because as we are invoking some of these provisions, you can find somebody say, but it's not WTO compliant, or it is compliant, and it becomes a big muddle, and in the end, the farmers lose out. Food aid. Again, we're looking for better disciplines for the administration of food aid. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. But before I move on to the next topic, all I wanted to let the audience know is that more and more in Africa now, we're getting better and stronger farmer and agricultural lobbies that are now holding the negotiators more accountable for what they do, governments more accountable. So it's not going to be easier. In the past, they'll come and have a negotiating round, come back and say, this is what we've agreed. Now they're being challenged. There are country negotiating groups, there's liaison committees. People are now sitting down the table and saying, hold on a minute, we're not happy with this. So more and more, the negotiations are going to be difficult. More and more, the African negotiators are going to be more accountable and will be addressing some of their negotiations to the lobbies. Aid for trade. This is, again, another issue. Is it part of the WTO? Is it out of the WTO? We believe, like it's been articulated before, this is something that is very essential for African economies. You can't run away from aid for trade. The framework has been developed to an extent through the CADEP process. Pillar 2, in fact, most of the pillars address, apart from maybe Pillar 3, they address the aid for trade issue. Again, the provisions for additional resources for aid for trade. We are worried that this is just going to be some sort of repackaging, rehashing of existing commitments under a new budget line to say this is aid for trade. And that is certainly not what we have in mind when we're looking at aid for trade. The effectiveness, the monitoring and evaluation, and enhanced coordination in delivery of aid for trade. Again, how will this be administered? Will it be a WTO? Will it be another agency? As far as we're concerned, we have we're looking at special purpose vehicles to be administered maybe by the regional economic communities like COMESA, and this could be overseen by the WTO or what. Again, there's a bit of unclarity, but nonetheless, we are really looking forward for aid for trade to address some of our supply side constraints and to address some of our developmental needs within Doha. Just to give you a little bit on the economic partnership agreements that we are looking at in Africa with the European Commission. We believe we're not yet ready for full liberalization, and we're saying that we're ready to bite the bullet, but we want this transition to be managed and negotiated with us so we move along with it. We've been reminded constantly that the EPA is a trade negotiation and it's not anything else. And again, we're now trying to refocus this whole thing and say it should have a developmental aspect and not confine itself to trade itself. The WTO, we believe and recognize, is a trading arrangement. But nonetheless, again, with special provisions like aid for trade, you can build into it a developmental aspect. We also believe the EPA is looking more outwardly towards maintaining preferences. And I think more focus should be more on regional trade and economic integration, because the whole concept of the EPA is to negotiate around a regional economic grouping. But the emphasis is moving away from regional integration and economic integration towards preferences. Again, we hope that this will force some analysis on supply side constraints and not just trade. There is a real danger for preference erosion on the side of the production side, or if you can say the supply side. And here we're looking at some sort of restructuring or compensation fund or something to enable our farmers to restructure themselves in the productive cycle. The loss of revenue, this is going to be, again, a very major issue for governments, because they are looking more at the EPAs and loss of revenue rather than how the EPAs could be used for developmental purposes. Reciprocity, I mean, this is a given. Impact assessment, there's been no impact assessment done on the effect of scenarios of how this will impact on agriculture. We are negotiating in a bit of a flux, in a bit of a vacuum. This is what we want, this is how we're going to move forward. But there's no scenarios being presented to us that if we agree to certain positions, what will be the impact of an EPA for agriculture in a given region or a given country. And that makes it a bit difficult. We're also hoping that if we have an impact assessment, this will lead into a sensitive and special products list, because that will be the logical phase to take it forward. Because when you do an impact assessment, that will highlight what are your sensitive products, what are your special products, and that will lead to it. And again, this is where we come in and said, well, we sit on the table and say, well, give us your sensitive list, give us your special products, and we move forward. But we really don't know what are, we can't actually back this with technical numbers to push this forward. The other is the involvement of non-state actors. Again, this is a requirement which I think is a very good provision within the EPA. But the problem is who can be classified as, if I can put it in inverted commas, genuine non-state actors. Because you'll find a lot of people on the table who probably are NGOs or others claiming to represent the farmers or any other lobby group or any other interest group. And are they genuinely, I mean, you're probably thinking, you said I was introduced as a farmer. Don't get deceived. If you come see me on my farm, I won't be dressed like this. I can assure you. Chris, how do I, it's stuck. I need to go on to the next one. How do I get on? This is one last one. How do I get on to the last one?
Let's just skip.
Okay, excellent. Oh, again, how did you do that? Let me do this quick. I thought I'll just draw in a bit about U.S. developments since we are in America. Our concerns are on the TPA expiry. I know it's a little way away, but if we are really concerned on the WTO of the ability of the U.S. to close the deal, can we reach a deal by end of March to allow for this provision to be used? Because after March, we've lost it. And I might add that over the years in Africa, we've been looking at the US as the leaders for market liberalization, as the leaders for reducing subsidies. And with your new farm bill and the new one you're going to negotiate now, the US is losing its position as the leader in trade liberalization, as the leader for more lesser trade distorting global trade. And that's a reality now. We're looking more towards the EU as perhaps the leader in this respect. In the past, we had the ability to go to the EU and say, no, look at the US, this is what they're doing. So the TPA is a major concern. Will it be renewed? Are we going into November when we'll start talking again? So it's going to have ramifications, and we are concerned about it. The US Farm Bill, again, it's used effectively for domestic support. It's used effectively for certain provisions within the boxes in the WTO. And it's a concern not only for cotton, but a lot of our issues, and generally for international trade. As I said, you can do it. America is a very strong economy. It's a strong country. But would you want to be seen in that context as a bully who can get away with it and doesn't play ball with the rest of the world? That's something that needs to be debated perhaps in the corridors of government or wherever. Food aid, it's not going to be a major issue, but nonetheless, it is something that we are going to insist on for better discipline and how it's going to be included in the round. It's not something that's going to be glossed over and lost. The major reason for this is our understanding of non-emergency food aid. Non-emergency food aid is we require more local or regional procurement, which we believe will lead to the development of markets and production and stimulate production in the region. Better rules for the monetization of food aid in recipient countries, because again, this has a negative impact. Food aid and its ability to displace local production. And also, finally, we believe that food aid, we're not saying it should always be in cash or it should be in kind. We're saying the recipient country should decide whether they want the aid to be in kind, or under certain circumstances they want it to be in cash. But by and large, you will find that food emergencies are localized and can be managed in a region. It was just 1991, I remember, we had a major drought in southern Africa. We had one recently in East Africa. But by and large, regionally, you can handle a food shortage. I thank you.
Thank you very much, AJ. I think there are actually two AJs. One is a farmer, and one travels around the world and explains African trade priorities. Maybe just a quick note for those of you who might not know. The EPAs are the Economic Partnership Agreements, which Europe is negotiating with African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And these will replace the so-called Lomé preferences, which have been in place for many decades. The main issue here is that they are moving from a preferential trade system to one of full reciprocity, obviously with phased-in reciprocity, but nonetheless heading towards full reciprocity. Maybe we could ask Chris maybe just to give us a few words considering the ambition behind the economic partnership agreements. In particular, they're supposed to be negotiated, I believe, by the beginning of 2008. Negotiations are supposed to be completed. And the Doha agenda, how does a group like COMESA prioritize or try to work on different sets of negotiations at the same time?
Oh, this thing on? Yeah. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. Since Charlotte has elevated me to the high table, yeah, let me also chip in here. I think for us, the situation is quite clear. Our focus is on improving the well-being of our people. The key point is that we are in the Doha round. We are in the development round. And so every table we come to, whether it is the EPA or it is AGOA or it is the Doha round itself within the WTO, what we want to bring to the table is that we would like to have support. We would like to have support for our people. The majority of our people are sitting in the agricultural sector on the continent. So indeed, as Ajay Vashi said, within the Economic Partnership Agreement, perhaps there was a lot of focus on what the trade arrangements would be between ourselves and the EU. But what we are doing is to strongly insert the development dimension. And the development dimension for us, it is agriculture. That's where the large majority of our people are sitting. And in inserting that dimension, we are not just doing it blindly. We have been preparing ourselves. I think that perhaps one point that can make everybody comfortable, because I think in the past there's also been support in agriculture, but perhaps those resources have been misused, and there has been no progress in the agricultural sector on the continent. The Secretary General referred to a situation where, in terms of our position, our trade position, we have gone down from 6% to 2%. But I think this situation can be reversed if the world listens to what we are trying to do. On the continent, we do have political will. We think we have the political will that is required now from our leaders to focus on their people. This program we are calling the CADIP, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, is a heads of state agricultural development framework program for the whole continent. It has certain targets. What we are saying is that we would like it to be a tool that is going to ensure that each one of our countries, each one of our member states within COMESA, and if possible, each one of our countries within the continent, in the African Union, grows at a rate of 6% per year in terms of the agricultural sector alone. 6% per year. Since this is where the large majority of our people are sitting, we think if we grow at that rate, we'll be able to reach also the global commitment of cutting hunger and poverty by the year 2015, cut it into half. Okay, at the present time, if you look at the COMESA region, for example, poverty runs quite high. It's around 80%. You know, and the population is not increasing. As we go forward, I mean, the population is not going down. As we go forward, the population is also increasing. But our target is that by the year 2015, we would like the poverty levels to be down to half of what they are now, 40% or below in the COMESA region. And 2015 is quite near. And this is not an issue of just inserting ourselves, coming to the table in terms of the Economic Partnership Agreement or the WTO and looking for resources. No. We are also saying this is our commitment, and therefore the heads of state have also directed that each country on the continent needs to put 10% of its national budget to be dedicated for agricultural development. So what we are saying is that we have a framework. We are going to put our own money into this framework, first of all, to try and develop the agricultural sector. But we know there will be gaps. The requirements are huge. As I've indicated, this is where the large majority of our people are sitting. So the requirements will be huge, and this is why we are looking for the partnership. But what we are saying is that we are developing this framework. It is a comprehensive framework. It is going, each country will have its own compact or framework under CADIP, addressing the major areas in agriculture which Secretary General referred to in terms of looking at issues of land and water management. The problem on the continent is that we do not control the environment. I mean, you know, perhaps this week you might say that even in the US it's not possible to control the environment. I think that today really the environment has controlled what we are trying to do here. But on the continent, really, issues of land and water management, it's very, very important to manage our land and water resources to ensure that the agricultural base is sustained, our productivity goes up. So that's a major pillar of CADIP in which we are looking for investment. The second pillar is trade and market infrastructure. It's a major pillar in which we are looking for investment. The third pillar is the issue of looking at the vulnerable communities. You need to do something, even as you are planning, to make sure that your vulnerable communities continue to also find livelihood in terms of perhaps delivering food aid. It must be well targeted. But the fourth pillar is the issue of science and technology. So what we are saying is that this is a comprehensive package that we have developed. It is pointing to priorities that we think are key. So if partners out there would like to work with us, we think that it makes a lot of sense to support this package, which has been comprehensively developed by experts, various stakeholders on the continent. Instead of developing other alternative or parallel programs which may not be targeting the priorities of stakeholders on the African continent. So we make ourselves available at every table, whether it's the Economic Partnership Agreement, whether in our discussions on AGOA, how to make it better, or in the multilateral discussions. We come to the table, and when we come to the table, we bring this key issue of development, and within development, we talk about agriculture, because this is the way forward for the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Bill Jackson from USTR has joined us. We're very pleased that USTR is here. Bill, maybe you want to say a few words perhaps about the TIFA discussions, or more generally about some of the, I don't know at what point you entered, what you heard of the discussion. We basically discussed COMESA's and Africa's objectives out of the Doha round, and a lot of discussion on CAATP as well. So I invite you just to make some remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry I got here a bit late. I think circumstances conspired against me this morning, even in the elevator on the way up. I got stuck. So I don't know, but I'm here and happy to be here. Especially happy to share the dais with Secretary General Mwencha. As you noted, Charlotte, we had a trade and investment framework agreement discussion between the U.S. government and COMESA yesterday, and for those of you who aren't familiar with that agreement or that process, it's a high-level meeting where we sit down once every year and a half or so, and we involve all the U.S. government trade-related agencies, and COMESA this time especially brought a very large delegation. We talk about a full range of trade issues. We talk about AGOA and how we can implement it better. We learn more about what COMESA is doing to advance regional integration and to advance its free trade area. We talked about trade capacity building and infrastructure. We talked about Doha. Ambassador Schwab opened the session yesterday, and Ambassador Bhatti, our deputy U.S. trade representative, also participated. And we also had a session on investment at the end of the day. We think very highly of the work that COMESA is doing. I don't think there's any regional economic organization on the continent that is doing more than COMESA in terms of really concrete things to bring together its members. The free trade area, the incredible work that is sometimes, I think, overlooked that they do in terms of trade facilitation and customs, speeding trade along the corridors. This is sort of the nuts and bolts work that must be done, especially given how many landlocked countries there are in COMESA and the challenges that transportation poses. So we had a good and full discussion yesterday. I don't know if exactly what was discussed before I got here. I can say that on the question that's posed in the title of today's program, What's at Stake in Africa, I can say a few words on that. I don't think that there's any group of countries in the WTO or in the world that has more at stake and has more to gain from an ambitious Doha agreement. All WTO members have much to gain. But I think that in Africa, because the impact of increased trade could have such a profound impact on poverty alleviation and economic development, that Africans stand to gain the most. And African leaders, including Secretary General Mwencha, have acknowledged that much, that trade can be a very powerful engine for development. And the single greatest opportunity we have right now to open trade worldwide is under Doha. I'm not going to go through all the World Bank studies. Some of my colleagues like to cite all the World Bank studies that are out there that demonstrate that African countries will benefit greatly out of Doha. I've seen other studies that say this much and studies that say that much, and people get involved in the statistics. Here's what you need to know about all of the studies that have been done on Africa and Doha. All of them agree on a single point, and that is the more ambitious we are in opening markets and removing trade barriers, the greater the benefits will be to all, and especially to the developing countries. One of the other little factoids that we like to quote a lot at USTR is that something that was in the Blair Commission report, which is that Africa's share of world trade, and I heard someone mentioning this just a moment ago, is currently at about 2%. Sub-Saharan Africa has about 2% of world trade. If Africa were to increase that by 1 percentage point, move from 2% to 3% of world trade, that will generate additional export revenues of about $70 billion. That's 3 times more than total development assistance to all sub-Saharan African countries. So I think that's a pretty graphic way of demonstrating that trade is really crucial to economic development and to poverty alleviation. Now, we also hear an awful lot about the Doha development agenda, and it's very clear that this particular multilateral round has a special focus on Doha, on development rather. I do think, though, that sometimes people overlook the most important development outcome. We hear an awful lot about flexibilities and special and differential treatment and special initiatives such as duty-free, quota-free treatment for lesser developed countries. All of those things are important. But the greatest benefits that will come, the greatest development benefits that will come out of the Doha round are really in the core negotiating areas, the increased market access that we would see in goods, both industrial and agriculture, and in services. And another thing that all the studies always point out is that the greatest benefits to developing countries in terms of global trade liberalization is the liberalization that they undertake in their own countries. That is, the tariffs in the world right now are the highest in many of the developing countries, especially some of the large emerging economies in India, Brazil, etc., and also within Africa. I think that COMESA has done a great job in terms of establishing its free trade area, and I think 13 members now, and so that eliminates tariffs in intra-COMESA trade, but there's still great trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff barriers within Africa. And that's another thing that we need to consider. Ambassador Schwab is actually on the Hill as we speak before the Ways and Means Committee talking about our trade agenda. One of the things that she has made very clear, and President Bush has reaffirmed this on several occasions lately, is that we're committed, the U.S. government is committed to a market opening Doha outcome, and that we are trying very diligently right now to make that happen. We have on the table, I think it's beyond dispute, some of the most ambitious proposals, including in agriculture, that anyone has seen. And we're prepared to lead. We're prepared to undertake the necessary reforms to advance the process, but we can't do it alone. And so we're looking to all of the developed countries, and also some of what are now being called the G20 countries, to make a major contribution to this round. Maybe I will just say one other thing so we can open it up to discussion. I did mention the duty-free, quota-free initiative that was agreed to in Hong Kong. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, let me just explain it very briefly. At the Hong Kong Ministerial, there was an agreement by the WTO members that developed countries would open up their markets for duty-free, quota-free access to all less developed countries in the world, up to 97% of that trade. And the agreement was that the results of that would be implemented along with the results of, that initiative, what we call DFQF, would be implemented along with the results from Hong Kong, from Doha, when there's a Doha agreement. So that is one of the things that that hinges on a Doha agreement. I will also just make a note that for many of the African countries, we at USTR have always had a little question in our minds about how much DFQF actually will benefit them, because already under AGOA, which includes most sub-Saharan African countries, including many non-LDCs such as Kenya and South Africa and Swaziland, we already offer virtually duty-free, quota-free access now. Something around 97-98% of African imports from Africa, AGOA countries, enter the U.S. duty-free. And I've actually looked at those statistics in greater detail, and of the remaining 2 or 3%, I'm thinking that at least half of that is statistical anomalies and cases in which someone just has not checked the box to claim the duty-free status. So duty-free, quota-free, it's a commitment that we have made. It may not be a big thing for a lot of African countries, but the Africa Group has supported it. And I mention this in part also because last month we published a Federal Register notice inviting public comments on U.S. future implementation of a duty-free, quota-free regime. There's no certainty about exactly how that would unfold right now, given the existing AGOA, GSP, and other preference programs. But we would certainly invite all interested parties. COMESA had indicated to us yesterday that they had some views on this issue, and so we would invite anyone to look up that Federal Register notice and send us their comments.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. Your focus on the different estimates that have been put on the table for how much market access will help developing countries reminds me there are also very differing estimates of what the impact of a reduction or elimination of trade distorting subsidies might be. But I think all of them point to the fact that there is, in fact, a benefit in reducing these or eliminating these subsidies, because they will decrease production in subsidizing countries and therefore lead to a price increase in the international price. Just very briefly, maybe a response on AGOA. Since we are talking about agricultural trade, I believe that AGOA still does not cover quite a number of agricultural products. So maybe that is an area where certainly there could be some improvement. But let's open it up to question, and I'll pass it back over to Kent.
Thank you, and thank the panel. This really has been an outstanding discussion and a very clear presentation of African-centered priorities. And Bill, thank you for joining us and braving not only the ice but the elevator, as it turns out, and providing an important USTR perspective. As I said, let's open it up for questions, and if you could please identify yourself and your organization. Yes, the gentleman there.
I'm Ed Barber from GoodWorks International. I want to also welcome the COMESA delegation, especially Secretary General.
If you could speak into the microphone, because
sorry.
We're recording and webcasting.
Yes, Ed Barber from GoodWorks International. I'm going to cheat and ask two questions, but I'll be brief. First is, with respect to regional organizations, of course, COMESA is very large and has a lot of members. And not only that, but some of the members are members of other groups, such as SADC and East African Community. And I wondered to what extent that obstructs your definition of a coordinated African position in areas like the WTO, or has COMESA simply taken pride of place in terms of agricultural negotiations, at least as far as East Africa is concerned? Has this gone off? And the second question is, with regard to putting content in the CADIP and other programs, there were references to agricultural development, to use of science and technology, and so on. I wondered to what extent COMESA is supporting more use of agricultural research organizations that you have in your territory, Sokoine Agricultural University in Tanzania, the International Livestock Research Institute near Addis, and others. Seems to me that there could be more content here below the political level in terms of developing crops in which Africa can be more competitive and so on. I'd appreciate a few comments on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary General, I think.
Thank you very much. The first question that was asked is, how does overlapping membership in Africa act as a barrier for, first of all, enhanced integration and also coordination of African position in multilateral settings? This is actually a question that is already preoccupying many Africans, and within the AU it was discussed even last year. And the AU discussion at the heads of state and government meeting that was held in Banjul looked at the number of regional economic groupings in Africa, which are many and which have varied kind of mandate and also programs. But the African Union then came up with 8 regional groupings which were designated as pillars for promoting African economic community. And that is within the framework of what you might call the Lagos Plan of Action and so forth. So for those 8, the next phase that is now in the offing is a coordination, or call it a convergence criteria that would help them to move towards being pillars of an African Union. And so that is what I would say, developments at continental level. But at the sub-regional level, particularly, say, within us, COMESA, SADC, and East African Community, and so forth, we have, of course, realized that because of overlapping membership, it's not easy for a member to take two totally separate obligations at the continental level and at sub-regional level. And so we have established mechanism to try and remove what you might call possible inconsistencies. For example, with SADC and the East African Community, we now have a framework where we meet and look at various programs we are doing, trade. In fact, there are some inconsistencies that we have already put on the table to look at. To give you an example, say rules of origin or trade facilitation measures and so forth. And we are developing an action plan on how to end up with a harmonized trade regime and so forth. But on the program areas, particularly when it comes to implementation of schemes like transport and air transport programs, we already have a mechanism. I can give you just one example for interest of time. Ministers of transport, we managed to bring them together, all three sets of ministers of transport, East African Community, SADC, and COMESA. So we have a common agenda on what we are doing in air transport, in trade facilitation, and we see this drifting towards being institutionalized, that at the end of the day, perhaps leading to a situation that as building blocks will start to become one as part of that in the African Union. But you also had a second, angle to it, to say, does it become a problem, particularly when you develop a common position at the international level? I would say no. In fact, we build our position from grassroots upwards. And you can see when Ache spoke and my presentation, one would have thought that him coming from non-state and I representing not quite state, we would be, in divergent, but the positions are harmonized because they are developed from grassroots and taken up. And because of that, we find a lot of common grounds. In fact, for economic partnership agreement with European Union, we are going in together and we compare notes at each state, and so is at the WTO. In fact, we have an African position. Bill was in Addis Ababa the other day, and he will tell you that at a meeting of ministers of trade in Africa, we don't even discuss regional positions because that is fed into the African position. That is already there. What we do is then improve tactics or information that informs that position. So there is that coming. And I think this is the future, that Africa has to harness its capacity, to harness its resources. And the only way is to bring harmony within the various groupings, to move from national country to do things in that harmonized way. I think Chris would answer the second question. He's better placed to talk about the elements you mentioned. So Chris,
thank you. Thank you, Jim. Basically the question was, what are we doing to ensure that the content that actually goes into the CADIP program is appropriate? I think that's the way I felt the question was posed, and there seems to have been, I think, focus on the issue of a collaboration with perhaps knowledge organizations like universities and research organizations. I think the bottom line is that we are very careful about what is going to go into the CADIP program. We would like the program to succeed. It is very, very important for Africa. And so what we have done, we do not have the monopoly of knowledge as COMESA Secretariat, as perhaps the unit that is managing the program for our region. And so what we have done is to go into strategic partnerships within the region. We have signed binding memoranda of understanding with several research organizations in our region. We have signed memoranda of understanding with the Association for Strengthening Agricultural Research in Eastern and Central Africa, ASARECA. We do have a binding memorandum of understanding with the Food and Agricultural Natural Resource Policy Network for Southern Africa, FANAPAN. We also have memorandum of understanding with several universities within the Comesa region. We are working with the University of Zambia. We are working with the Tegemeo Institute in Kenya. It's just a select list of key stakeholders that are informing the CADIP process. At the continental level, we are working with the Forum for Agricultural Research, which is headed by Dr. Monty Jones. They give us the overall framework in terms of science and technology. They give us the overall framework for the continent. But that just informs us in terms of what is happening at the continent. In terms of the regional level, we have our own arrangement, which is mainly constituted by this memorandum of understanding we have put in place with the knowledge organizations. We have not restricted ourselves to just regional or national organizations within the Comesa region. This process needs to be informed by other stakeholders also. When we arrived here in Washington, our first stop was the International Food Policy and Research Institute. We do have an agreement with them. They are also contributing to this process. We have also signed an agreement with Michigan State University. They have been quite strong in terms of issues of agricultural policy in our region for many years. So we are working with them. So there is a lot that is going in terms of informing the process. And it is not just research organizations. The private sector are very crucial. Everybody has been talking about the large Comesa delegation that is here, and most of the people on this delegation are private sector representatives. They are leaders of private sector in our region. We have signed with them also binding agreements to make sure they contribute to the process. Even when you are talking about science and technology, the private sector has a lot to contribute because we want to ensure the science and technology we are going to focus on is demand driven according to the experiences of our private sector in the region. So we have signed agreement with the SACAO headed by Ajay Vashi. We have signed agreements with the East African Farmers Federation. For North Africa, we have agreements with associations in Egypt. And this is the big Comesa family. So Comesa is huge, but for us, this gives us actually the competitive advantage of being able to tap all the knowledge bases that we have in this big part of our continent, and be able to see how we can use this huge market effectively. So everybody is at the table. The private sector, research organizations are all at the table and doing their best to inform the design of CADIP and also to choose the best early actions that we can focus on and put investments in right now. Thank you so much.
Jim? And then Missy?
I'm Jim Starkey. I'm a member of the IPC. Bill, before you got here, the Secretary General expressed some concern about the duty-free, quota-free offer that's on the table. Precisely, no one knows what's in the 3% of the tariff lines that's excluded. And my suspicion, which I'm sure is totally unfounded, is that everything that is of interest to these countries is in that 3%, at least as far as the U.S. is concerned. Now, you indicated in your comments that the U.S. is prepared to lead in these negotiations. So why doesn't the U.S. go ahead and offer 100% duty-free, quota-free treatment to these 32 poorest countries in the world? Give them something to be interested in, to apply pressure, because the other thing that, of course, has been lacking in the whole thing is strong pressure and leadership from the African countries pushing the U.S., the EU, and Japan to make progress. So here's an area where you could lead, where you would get great acclaim throughout the world for helping the poorest countries in the world. So how difficult could that be? Thanks.
Not that we want to put you on the spot, Bill.
I took advantage of your absence.
Well, it's interesting that you should have mentioned COMESA in this respect, because one of the things that we have actually heard from many countries in Africa is please consider keeping apparel and textiles in the 3% that you're excluding, because if you don't, we're going to lose most of our AGOA apparel business. That's an interesting perspective because, again, as I note, the Africa Group was foursquare behind the DFQF initiative, and yet there are clearly some countries in Africa that would not benefit if AGOA-like preferences were extended to non-African countries, including some of their strongest competitors in the apparel market. So that's a consideration. And in fact, the Kenyan trade minister, now of course Kenya is not a LDC, but the Kenyan trade minister said publicly, he asked us to include textiles and apparel items in that 3%. There are sensitivities in the U.S. to certain products. There is this challenge that we face in terms of what I just laid out. How would this affect the African countries? And so that's where we are on this right now. There have been no decisions on what the 3% will cover. That is precisely why we've sought public comments. We know there will be a lot of people in the United States from various perspectives who will be interested in having one or more of their products included in that 3%. But as it stands right now, you don't have to believe me. You can check with the World Bank. The U.S. economy is the most open to developing country imports of any of the major developed countries in the world. And so I think that we've already shown leadership in that respect.
Missy.
Hi, Missy Ryan from Reuters. This question was for AJ and for any of the other panelists. You mentioned that one of the things that some of the African countries were looking for was special rules or assistance on the dispute settlement process. And I was hoping you could talk about that in a little bit more detail. And also, for any of the panelists, I'm just hoping to get some thoughts on the proposal in the Bush administration's 2007 Farm Bill plan to reform the food aid procurement rules to allow up to 25% of the food for peace aid to be bought in the region or in the country where a food crisis is occurring. I'm wondering if you think that that's a good step. Is it enough? Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, when I said special rules, you will find that if you find there's been an infringement within the WTO rules, you could lead to some actionable procedures, but you will find that this will entail, one, a lot of cost, two, it will require a lot of legal expertise, and it will also require a lot of investigation and presentation to be put forward, which virtually makes it impossible for most of the private sector within Africa and the public sector to take some action. I mean, I don't want to say this and there's somebody from the Trade Department, but the issue of cotton, I mean, cotton shouldn't have been brought to Cancun and made an issue. It should have been taken for dispute settlement straight away. It shouldn't have waited till Doha. Till we went to Cancun and made an issue. The only country that we know who are using this effectively were the Brazilians, and as I said, to an extent, some countries in the Far East. But there's been no African country that has had the ability to use this clause. And that's what I meant, that we needed something which would be perhaps more suitable or user-friendly, or something that we can invoke easily within the WTO without all the cumbersome procedures, the costs involved, to take notify for something.
And that second question on the food aid provision in the President's budget.
For me,
okay. Let me start. Ajay, I know, has views on this issue also since he was at the food aid meeting a few days ago. Unless I misunderstood the question, it sounded like good news to me, because it was talking about up to 25% of the food aid to be bought from within the region. if that's what this bill seems to be providing for. If that is the situation, that is good news for the COMESA region in particular. We do have indeed problems of food insecurity in COMESA. Those food insecurity challenges tend to be localized in certain parts of certain countries, but at the same time, we usually have food surpluses within the region. And the challenge is perhaps there's nobody to buy, because WFP has been bringing the food from outside. Of course, we have challenges of transportation, but WFP has, I think, the capacity to be able to overcome. They have a very strong network in our region. The WFP, it appears on its own, has already started doing this, actually, in our region. But it seems to me that they needed a strong message. And the U.S. government has very strong influence within the WFP. They needed a strong message that the U.S. government is also supporting this, that WFP can be used as a marketing tool, as a marketing mechanism within the region. I think Ajay in his presentation emphasized the point that it is something that we can deal with. Most of the food insecurities we face within the region are really situations that we can deal with if they are supported by workable mechanisms like the capacity that WFP has. So we do have a lot of pockets of food insecurity in our area, but there are always a lot of pockets also of food surpluses in our region. If you look at the way the COMESA region is geographically, in terms of issues of the situation of rainfall, because usually the major cause of food insecurity in our region is drought. But you will also find that we also have the highest amount of rainfall on the continent, because the so-called intertropical convergence zone, which is the meeting of the wind that controls rainfall in Africa, is really centered around COMESA. If you look at the DRC, Tanzania, and so on, northern Zambia, there's a lot of rain there. Those are areas of actually food surpluses. A lot of parts of Tanzania, food surpluses all the time. Northern Zambia always has food. The problem is how to move it around. So if there is that encouragement in the bill that 25% of the food should be sourced from the region, it will help a lot in terms of providing a market for our producers. Thank you so much.
Just a little addition. I think it's a good development, although our understanding is this is more seen as a pilot within the bill rather than something that will be more entrenched. And the concern is that if it's going to be a pilot, it can be applied over a longer period. I think it should be immediately applied. There are also concerns about the ability for local procurement with standards and packaging, and that if that thing does go ahead, it will displace local production. These are myths, I would say, which don't stand. The WFP has procured consistently with 3 or 4 countries like Zambia, South Africa, Kenya, to an extent Ethiopia, without encountering any problems. So at the same time, while it's welcome, we are concerned that it's seen more as a pilot rather than something which is believed in, because when you say it's a pilot, you're testing it. And there's concern on the American administration that, or whoever's involved, that this will create displacement of local production and markets, which is not correct. But it's welcome that there is movement in that direction.
Lady in the back, and then the gentleman here.
Julie Howard from the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa, and welcome to our old friends, the COMESA delegation. Mr. Secretary General, I welcomed your focus on infrastructure, and particularly in talking about what might be done most usefully with regard to aid for trade and the important role of regional infrastructure. And as you also noted, I think it's been difficult for both the bilateral and the multilateral donor agencies to really figure out how to best support regional infrastructure, which is so very, very critical to, as you say, moving goods around, especially for the landlocked countries of COMESA. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about COMESA's role in brokering deals that can really push these regional infrastructure projects forward. We view a bit with concern sort of the slow movement on the short-term projects that have been designated by NEPAD, and wonder how COMESA plays a role now and how it could play a role in the future. And AJ, I also wanted to ask you what you think of how is the role of the private sector and the Farmers Union in actually weighing in on what are the priority infrastructure investments in your area? What kind of role do you play? Thank you.
First of all, I'm happy to see Julie in the audience because Julie is one person that has a really large heart for Africa and has been working so much to advance our agenda, and thank you for that question. You are right that under the short-term action plan for NEPAD, there is slow movement, and that is one aspect that has also concerned us, even at the COMESA level. In fact, at the last summit, we got the heads of state and government to sit back and reflect on what are the challenges in terms of implementing regional programs. And we see the major problem being one, having capacity to manage those programs. The way these programs are being managed up to the moment is more or less a national approach with very little capacity, and hoping that each country will act in concert. And if you are doing a road or electricity interconnection, it will happen by each country taking the actions, and then you have a program in place. And so for us, one of the reasons why we established the COMESA Fund is precisely to do that. When I talked about the 3 windows, one window is to have a capacity to be able to do what you might call management, pre-investment management of the project, for bringing the parties together, doing studies and coordination mechanism. And that is a very crucial element of the NEPAD process and also at the national level. The second one is financing instruments available to finance regional programs. If you go to many of the development agencies, World Bank, for instance, which has done a lot in terms of infrastructure development in Africa, it's not easy for World Bank to finance a regional entity like COMESA that has a program on infrastructure. They would rather lend bilaterally. And you know what that means. If you are going to lend bilaterally, each country will have different priorities, and those priorities may not be coincidental at a given point in time. And so that delays implementation. And so is ADB, and so is even the European Development Bank. And that is because instruments, whether you are going to look for a guarantee mechanism to secure the loans, you take the state as a sovereign obligor, and that is a problem. But as COMESA, we are now starting also to develop regional instruments. That's one of the reasons we have established the African Trade Insurance Agency, the ATI, as a regional capacity. And this is regionally owned, and therefore, in fact, that is one, to us, a big push for countries to agree to integrate even on risk, that they can now jointly guarantee a project of multinational nature. The third aspect, and we see this as important, is also all this is been implemented based on ODA. And we know that ODA is declining or stable, and there is no capacity really to continue to depend on ODA to implement regional programs. If you are going to bring in the private sector and all these funds, you need to create mechanism, strong mechanism, and therefore any special purpose vehicle you set up needs to be carefully engineered, bring the parties at an early stage like what we are doing under CADIP, and move that process forward. These are all systems we are putting in place to manage, and you can see, Churi, we've been more on the planning, but we are starting to break through. For instance, we now see a lot of interconnection is starting to take place, and this is because of strong leadership, particularly from the private sector. See what ESCOM has done for the Southern African Power Pool. We are established now East African Power Pool. We are going to do the same kind of thing when it comes to ICT and so forth. So this is the direction we are going. But unfortunately, with the history we had, we couldn't move as fast as we would have liked. And you are right, it hasn't been as one would have wished.
This gentleman here.
We had the question for AJ still.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Beg your pardon.
You're quite correct. We also saw under the NIPAD program and under CADEP that the logical place initially for the private sector to work with would have been Pillar 2, which was the markets and trade-related infrastructure. And indeed, this is something that we have notified the NIPAD Secretariat and the CADEP program is something we want to take forward as a private sector. Under this pillar also, perhaps, which is there, which perhaps is not so known, was a cross-cutting issue of strengthening private sector organizations. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on this because that's going to lead me into why certain things have not moved. And as I said, I agree, things haven't moved forward. We believe that the prioritization and identification is something which the private sector can move along quite easily. But it's another thing to have the capacity to develop and package projects, and micromanage them a little bit along and push them in the right direction. To this effect, what has happened is to move with the political dispensation or the economic dispensation, where we have now regional groupings. Both under SADC, we have what we call the SADC Business Forum, and in COMESA, we have the COMESA Business Council. Now, these are two private sector bodies that are interacting with these regional economic groupings, and they consist of sub-regional private sector organizations such as mine, which is the sub-regional farmers grouping, and then we've got others from commerce, we've got others from manufacturing, railways, the whole segment of private sector that's moving. And we've undertaken to say we're going to be the private sector complement of this project. But there's again a capacity constraint, and that's something which we want to push forward to see if we can identify, prioritize certain projects. One thing which we are moving very rapidly with is the regulatory framework. There's this issue about private-public partnership in infrastructure development. But you can't move step one because the regulatory framework doesn't allow for that. And we're trying to move forward and try and harmonize this within the region. And that's some of the little bits that we're trying to do. But I hope that given time, we should be able to concretize and have something more concrete on the ground.
Just behind you, there's a microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, David Tort of Dublin with DAI. It's interesting. We didn't talk, but my questions are very similar to the ones that were just posed, but I might take a slightly different angle. And it's almost as if I needed to ask my question quickly before the answers already came. So, but I wondered, especially for Secretary General Mwencha, you talked about the supply side issues and saying that having market access was not good enough. And you talked about infrastructure, and there was a question, of course, about that. But I thought more generally, and I think you also responded to that to some extent, but the issue of how do you get, in order to get these kinds of investments that you need, infrastructure and other kinds of things for the supply side, you need, of course, the technology, you need investments, you need capital, you need good regulations, you need laws, etc. And I just wonder to what extent, what kind of initiatives COMESA is taking on its own, but also what kind of pressure it's putting to its member countries to put in place those kinds of regulations, the kinds of laws that make it easier for investments to come in.
Thank you very much. And it's a very important question because at the core of all the issues that we face in Africa is to see more investment. And when you look at the root causes of why Africa is not investing enough, and with all the NEPAD intentions that we are saying, let's grow at 7%, let's invest about 25%, let's see more FDIs coming to Africa. The question that comes is, why is this not happening at the moment? And there are many causes. One, of course, is even when we may be talking of COMESA being a market of 400 million people with the GDP of some 277 billion, it is not a single market. It is still a distorted market where you find it's a silos of all the various 19 markets. And until you start to see a single market, because if you are looking at one market of Burundi, I mean, million of people there, what is the purchasing capacity? I mean, you and I know today that the reason China, India is growing is because there's a huge internal market. We don't have a huge internal market. Africa has resources, but we don't have a market. And that is a fact. And the market, and then when you move to the next segment, why is there no market? You hit the infrastructure because it's not there. Even the little market is out there. You cannot reach it because you can't move goods quickly enough. And even where we have established schemes, like the free trade area and the rest, you need them to be firm enough to be on the ground, go through, time and be stable, so that you can then make it known that there is. As I walk around, even in the U.S., how many people know there is commerce out there with a free trade area? It's still not known. And even when you may come there, Bill was mentioning in his presentation that you still have all these non-tariff barriers. We have removed tariffs, but we still have non-tariff barriers. And the non-tariff barriers will be some of it in the capacity aspect, that I could have my product from Zambia and I arrive at the border, but I don't have even a certificate of SPS certificate. So they cannot go through. That is, a farmer doesn't even have a place where to go and get it. It's at the border. You require this farmer, if he's, as Chris was saying, is in northern Tanzania, or southern Tanzania, or northern Zambia, he can't move that maize across because he has to come to Lusaka to get his SPS certificate, to go back to the border, to cross the border to sell the maize. That will not happen. So those are the development issues we are talking about. Let's have roads that will reach the farm. Let's put phytosanitary capacity so that you can, let's have standards. Those are development issues. And that's where there's the delay. So you go right from at the farm level to the national level, where we are saying, can we make these truly stable trade regimes that are predictable, that are permanent, that can stand the test of time. And when you do that, you have a single market that you can now see people investing. Not that we have not done a lot, but it's still not there. And I'm the first to admit that we are perhaps in scale of 10 when we are moving to 100, and so it's a long way to go.
Well, thank you very much. We really have held you past the time we promised, and we very much appreciate your patience in waiting until we could survive, at least in part, the inclement weather. I'm going to turn this back to Charlotte for some final comments, but I would just like to add my own thank you again for coming to the Wilson Center, and thank the panel. I think it's fair to say that even with this inclement weather, that you've managed to add some icing to the trade policy cake here at the Wilson Center. Charlotte.
Thank you as well to all the panelists. We'll try to sum up the discussions, which is a difficult task. I also want to thank very much Lynn Shaw of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the IPC staff that has helped put together the program today. Amy Testa, Cara Laney, and Yvonne Siu are all in the audience.
We had Mitch and Matt here who held the microphones and did a lot of the background work.
Trying to sort of summarize the discussions, I have three different thoughts. One, Doha remains very important. It is important to have an ambitious outcome to this round. It's important for African countries not only to have special and differential treatment, but also to undertake their own commitments and move towards trade liberalizations themselves. I found very intriguing the discussion on duty-free, quota-free. Maybe it's fair to say that certainly the EU has a very difficult time coming up with coordinated positions. So imagine what it must be like for the African Union, which has so many more countries. So, but this kind of discrepancy between, you know, if you will, developing country solidarity and pushing for 100% duty-free, quota-free, and on the other side, some countries saying, well, but, you know, in textiles that could really hurt us, reminds me a little bit of the other issue in the Doha negotiations, which is special products, where you have the G33 asking for 20% exemption of special products, exemption from market trade liberalization. And I would imagine that there are some LDCs out there that are saying, wow, you know, that's not really in our interest. We in the Doha negotiations don't have to undertake any commitments anyway. So now some of these actually wealthier developing countries would get such a broad range of exemptions. Is that really in our interest? So just to say that there is not a monolithic group of developing countries out there, I think is important to take away from that discussion. And also that regardless, we are moving towards a system where preferences are simply being eroded. And this will happen with or without a Doha round. This trend will continue. And I think the Secretary General put it very well. He said what the focus now, therefore, needs to be is competitiveness. That's really how we are going to be able to increase African exports within a regional basis, but also outside of Africa, which then leads to the very important role that CAADP plays in addressing, in making agriculture a priority for African governments. I think a very, very important issue. And also the whole aid for trade discussion. But we need to, obviously, we have a lot of work to do, I think, to make the aid for trade debate a little more practical, a little more targeted. And I think there is a clear need to look at regional issues here. And I believe that the recommendations that the Aid for Trade Task Force put out were actually criticized for not putting enough emphasis on regional aspects. So maybe it's important to look at how to implement aid for trade on a regional level, in particular in Africa, to look at the infrastructure needs and to see who are the players that can really come together here to tackle this problem, which after all shouldn't be that difficult to solve, is always my feeling when I hear about these problems. But we still have a long ways to go. I thank everybody very much for their contributions and all of you for braving the inclement weather and joining us. Thank you so much.